Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. My name is Keiran.pedley. On this week's episode, we're going to be taking a look back at the local elections and a look ahead to what it all means for the ever upcoming general election, presumably next year. And to do some of that, I'm joined by my colleagues Cameron.garrett and holly.day. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Keiran.
Hi, Keiran.
So I thought we'd start with a bit of a kind of lay of the land, where we think we are at the moment. Holly, I'll come to you first. Lots going on. What's your take on the past few weeks?
I think the local elections definitely stand out to me. It's something I always, it's weird to say you look forward to local elections. I'm not sure many other people do, particularly with the turnout figures we got. But I think there were some really interesting results. There's been a lot of commentary around it, a lot of polling around it, and obviously off the back of it, the Conservatives and Labour both have a lot to think about, as well as I think the Lib Dems and the Greens, which I think we're going to talk a bit about now.
Cameron, how about you?
Very much the same. I think everyone's been obsessing over as Holly says, not everyone, but certainly us have been obsessing over
all the cool kids have been obsessing, Cameron,
over the local election figures, and obviously the way you can spin it either way for either party. Labour obviously made some good wins on the night in Stoke and East Staffordshire, for example, places they'd want to win, but maybe not necessarily going far enough. Keiran, what are your thoughts on kind of what played out in the locals? I know you've been watching closely.
Yeah, so I think that the first thing we always have to acknowledge or leave at the door is that clearly local elections are different from general elections. So turnout is considerably lower, probably more than half what it would be at a general election. And our polling shows that people do understand they're voting for different things. They're not voting for the government. That said, there are enough patterns when we look at local election results to general election results to at least get a sense of where the wind's blowing. And personally, I think when I look at the last local elections, I'm looking at the projected national vote share from the BBC. No particular shade on Rawlings and Thrasher there, but just that's the one that I picked the numbers for. And in sort of trying to get a sense from that and other indicators as to what the direction of travel is. So for those people that don't know, and I imagine most people watching or listening to this will, Labour won the national vote share, projected national vote share by 9 points. And initially it felt that was not the best result given the current polling. The types of governments that have won from opposition, so Blair in 97 and Cameron in 2010, had been sort of mid-teens ahead in local elections the previous year before winning their, those respective general elections. And so at face value, it looked like Labour hadn't done quite enough. And I think there still is an argument to some extent Labour hasn't sealed the deal. But at the same time, when we look at the types of governments that have come back from similar deficits before, both Blair governments in 2001 and 2005, they did come back from similar deficits a year before to win. They were nowhere near as unpopular as this government. So this government currently has a net satisfaction rating of -61. The types of governments that have recovered from this position have been less unpopular than that. And similarly, the governments of Gordon Brown and John Major, respectively, were similarly unpopular. So whilst there are never certainties in politics, and I know from bitter experience not to talk about certainties, it does look on the negative side for the government. It does look like we're heading for a change of government next year. The exact composition we'll sort of talk about, I guess, as we go.
I think it's an interesting point you make about dissatisfaction with the government. One thing I was looking at recently was how sustained that dissatisfaction is. So in its lifetime, Rishi Sunak's government hasn't gone above -60, which is never happened before. Obviously, still 6 months in, but the fact it isn't, and that's being sustained. Usually you get these dips where governments become unpopular very close to the end of their lifetime. And the fact it's continuing throughout and not peaking, even though Rishi Sunak's numbers themselves have seen some fluctuations, government satisfaction just isn't.
And there were some quite big numbers during the locals that I think at the start of the night people were saying they were expecting the Conservatives to lose around 1,000 seats, and that kind of struck me as quite a big number. Conservative commentators were coming on saying, well, if we lose 1,000 seats, actually that might be a decent result, which I think puts that in the context of how they were feeling at the start of the night compared to how they were feeling at the end of the night. And I saw quite a couple of good sound bites. Like, for example, for the first time in more than 20 years, the Conservatives have fewer councillors than Labour, which I'm surprised I've not kind of seen more of that flying around. They lost more than half of the councils they were defending as well. So some of the numbers were really quite striking. I found it's always interesting on an election night how different commentators and people from the different wings of the parties kind of frame things. Like you said at the start, Cameron, Labour were possibly hoping for a better night, and it's kind of strange to say hoping for a better night when you've managed to do some of the things that I've just said they managed to do. The Lib Dems and the Greens also, I think, is something that's worth mentioning. The Greens won their first council, took control of their first council, which is pretty momentous for them. And the Lib Dems seem to be making a bit of a comeback, although they obviously have always done a bit better in locals. But it'd be interesting off the back of kind of what happened in the early 2010s, that they seem to be making a bit of a resurgence, and seeing if that then translates into kind of overall vote intention figures at a national level for a general election, for them to make a bit of a play and possibly become kingmakers again.
We'll come back to some of that, but I think because with this whole discussion about tactical voting and hung parliaments and things, which we'll talk about on this podcast. But I think, for me, looking at the current situation, it's very clear that the government is unpopular. I mean, I know that that's a sort of no Sherlock type sort of thing.
Close there, Kieran.
Yeah,
well saved.
Family show and everything. But I know that's not surprising to people that the government's unpopular. But the scale of unpopularity is important. And I think, Cameron, you talked about Rishi Sunak's numbers. It doesn't seem to be a Sunak effect. It seems to be almost despite him. I mean, his poll ratings are generally okay. I wouldn't exaggerate it either, but when you ask who would be the most capable prime minister, Sunak and Starmer are pretty much neck and neck. Now, if I'm Labour, I'm not unhappy about that, because, to be honest, in the past few elections we've had, the leadership question has always benefited the Conservatives in terms of who you want in number 10. If they go into the election with that as essentially a draw, then I don't think that would, whilst you'd like to be ahead, I don't think Keir Starmer and his people would mind that. But it's just that time for a change narrative that seems to be building. However you ask that question, our most recent Ipsos political monitor has 8 in 10 thinking it's time for a new team of leaders. We've seen in previous polls 2/3 thinking it's time for a change. So that is the dynamic that's really, really hard for the Conservatives to shift, because whilst there might be nuances and bits about Labour that the public aren't sold on, I think the turbulence of the last year has really damaged the Tory brand to the extent that it's very hard to see how they make peace with that and come back. Let's talk a bit about tactical voting, though, because that's one thing I alluded to a moment ago. Holly, one of the questions about the local elections was partly related to this national vote share point, but also partly related to the performance of the Lib Dems and Greens. How much would this be replicated at a general election? What does this mean for the potential for tactical voting? What do our numbers say about some of those issues?
Yeah, so by tactical voting, we're obviously talking about voting for a party that wouldn't ordinarily be your first choice when you're voting at an election. And I've seen it described off the back of the local elections as kind of a pincer movement. So people are voting for whoever they basically think seems best placed to beat the Conservatives, and that plays out in our numbers as well. So our recent political monitor found 1/3 of people saying they'd be likely to vote tactically in the next election. I was surprised by how high that number is. I'd be interested to see whether you guys think that's overstated. Obviously, we're potentially a year out, whether people actually, when it comes down to voting, would then do that is always interesting.
I mean, just to interject briefly there, I mean, I think when you talk about likely, it's very or fairly likely, I think. And so I suppose it's a bit of a nerdy polling question, but then that's what we're here for. I mean, what does fairly likely to vote tactically mean, I suppose? But yeah, I mean, there's certainly, at the same time, I think the very likely figure was around 18%, so still quite high. But still, it shows that people are prepared to be sort of clever and nuanced in how they behave, doesn't it? Anyway, sorry, go on, Holly.
No, it does, and I think for the Conservatives, the worrying part is when we ask the people who say they are either very or fairly likely to tactically vote, kind of why they would do it. 2/3 are saying they do it to keep the Conservatives out. So whether that be because their first preference would be Labour, but they might then vote for the Lib Dems to keep the Tories out, or vice versa. It's basically bad news for the Conservatives in a lot of seats that people with either Lib Dem or Labour preferences are saying that they'd switch between those two parties effectively to just stop the Conservatives winning with whoever was best placed there. So I'd be interested to see what your guys' thoughts are on kind of the impact that potentially has on the next election. I know we've seen a lot of Conservative MPs saying they're going to stand down at the next election. Whether or not that's related to this is speculation, but I think the number we're up to at the minute is 32 Conservative MPs who have confirmed they're standing down at the next election, including most recently Dominic Raab announcing that yesterday. So some quite big hitters.
And he was facing a Lib Dem, he was essentially a Lib Con marginal as well. So it's a good example of what you're talking about, I think.
Exactly, and interestingly, we can't kind of, the local election boundaries and the general election boundaries are very different, but a lot of the places where we saw these resurgences from the Lib Dems or some tactical voting in the local elections are places where some of these big hitting Tory MPs or ministers are. So Dominic Raab's constituency, for example, Michael Gove's constituency, quite a few of them are potentially looking a bit nervous in the run-up to next year.
There's some analysis from the academic Rob Ford, who has been looking at the local election results, and he has worked out that the places where the Tory party did better in 2019 is actually where they did worst in this set of local elections, so where their vote share fell the most, where there were incumbent Tories in the seat. And he's kind of attributing that to people being determined to get kind of an incumbent out and being against the Tory party. Stephen Bush, in his latest article in the Financial Times, called it negative partisanship. People aren't actively saying they like this party, they just know they hate this party, and kind of forming their opinions on that. And if that is sustained into a general election, that would be interesting and have some ramifications. But it's always to what extent will it? I feel like we always talk about tactical voting, and does it come into fruition in an actual general election?
I mean, I think it depends on the context of the seat, right? You can definitely imagine tactical voting benefiting the Liberal Democrats quite a lot. And I think one of their successes, they do seem to have moved on from the coalition days. I suppose that's a good 8 years ago now since Nick Clegg was turfed out and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I think that where they're second to the Conservatives, that will obviously be on people's minds. But I do think it's always something that people are fascinated by. But I mean, in the end, some of that macro position between Labour and the Conservatives is going to be ultimately decisive. I mean, like the tactical voting element will certainly help. I mean, it sort of reminds me a bit of the US election when Joe Biden beat Donald Trump, where it wasn't so much enthusiasm for Joe Biden as it was people really motivated to vote Donald Trump out. And I don't think that's the case with Rishi Sunak as an individual, but I think with the Conservative Party at the moment, that feels like where we are. And I suppose, I mean, before we go on to hung parliaments and things, I mean, what do we think what do they do about it? Because obviously, Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives don't want to necessarily just fold. It feels like they've got to start showing some delivery, doesn't it?
I think the problem that they've got is, particularly from the recent election results that we saw, Labour was starting to do well again in those. I really don't like traditional red wall heartlands type language, but it's long. There are long-winded ways to have to explain it otherwise, but traditional red wall heartlands, they're doing well in kind of leave-leaning constituencies again. That'll be a bit of a worry for the Conservatives because their 2019 vote share, their 2019 voters, a lot of them were people from the north, from the red wall, who had leave-leaning affiliations. So if they're starting to kind of lose that cohort of people, that's probably a bit worrying for them. I guess the 5 pledges that they've come up with are an attempt to alleviate some of that, and if they can show that they can deliver on some of those, because some of them do have measurable outcomes, whether you set yourself up for failure or not by setting targets or not, given the a lot of the rhetoric that's going around and the things that are in the news, for example, to do with immigration at the minute. Rishi Sunak's made that one of his key pledges. It's very much in the news, so people are going to know about it if he doesn't hit that target. So I think, as you said, like delivery and outcomes on the things that they've now promised to do in the next year, people are going to want to see tangible results. And if they don't see that, then the Conservatives probably have to put their hands up and say, yeah, we didn't deliver that. So, you can't be surprised that people weren't voting for you in that regard.
And what we're starting to see from them as well is kind of attacking the idea of a coalition or that Labour doing a deal, coalition of chaos, etc., which kind of worked for them in 2015 when they had Ed Miliband in Alex Salmond's pocket, etc. I think whether it works this time will be hard because it's hard to say. You're going to get chaotic government from them given the past 6 months or so.
Well, let's talk about that, Cameron. So we've asked the public about what they expect the outcome of the next election to be and their perception of different hung parliaments. So what do our numbers show?
Yep. So since the local elections, obviously commentary has kind of been obsessed of is there going to be a hung parliament or not with Labour's numbers. And obviously that means where one party doesn't get an overall majority and they would need to deal with another party. That could be kind of a formal coalition like Lib Dems and Conservatives in 2010, or it could be a supply and demand deal like the Conservatives and DUP in 2017, where the kind of a party will support you to get through the big stuff, your budget, your King's Speech, etc. Conversation is very much Labour leading as the biggest party, Labour going into a hung parliament, and that's kind of where the public are at as well. So 60% of the public, when we ask them, predict a hung parliament, and 43% of that is Labour as the biggest party, 17% with Conservatives as the biggest party. We're only looking at around 28% saying a majority, and that's only 8% of people predicting a Conservative majority, which I think is incredibly low considering the strength they were at after the last election. And I think kind of this conversation around a hung parliament is very much being framed by the local election results, where it was kind of like, have Labour done enough? But then also kind of the monumental challenge facing the Labour Party. I think we're talking about Labour potentially winning the next election would be, they wouldn't believe that after the 2019 result when they're at their doldrums, lowest since 1935, and they need to be winning 123 seats to have a majority of one. So I think this is where we've entered the territory of talking about a hung parliament.
Yeah, and I always come back to this, and like as I say, any rules, and there are gifs and sort of memes about this. Rules are there to be broken in terms of records. You often say, no one has done X since Y, and then it happens, and then therefore that rule is broken. But I always stress to people that we've had two national swings of around 10 points or more since the Second World War. One was in 1945 itself, in the aftermath of that war, and the other was in 1997. And some of it depends kind of where you start the timer, as it were, but or what you think the exact position of the parties is. But right now we are seeing sort of implied swings of 12-13% from the last general election. I think that's about right. So now that can happen. And look, if there's ever going to be circumstances for that to happen, perhaps it is in a scenario where lots of people in Brexit areas, former Labour voters, lent their vote to Boris Johnson, for want of a better phrase, to get Brexit done in a very specific set of circumstances. Then we had a global pandemic and war in Ukraine, and several prime ministers later, Boris Johnson long gone. These are the conditions in which you can imagine Jeremy Corbyn replaced with Keir Starmer. These are the conditions that you can imagine seismic shifts, but we shouldn't underestimate what seismic shift that is when we're looking at the next election. There are lots of people online that seem to get almost offended when you say that there's a prospect of a hung parliament with Labour as the largest party. I think if you'd asked the Labour Party about that in early 2020, they'd have bit your hand off, frankly.
And it's worth saying that people want a majority government. So they're predicting a hung parliament, but they do want a majority government. 49% say that would be their preference. And that's because they predict chaos in a hung parliament situation. We asked the public what would happen if Labour were the biggest party with no overall majority, and we asked them what would happen if Conservatives were the biggest party with no overall majority. we had 54%, so the majority agreeing there'd be chaos under the Conservatives in that situation, and 41% agreeing there'd be chaos under the Labour Party in that situation.
Yeah, so they're individual statements. It's agree, disagree on each scenario. So it's not. I know that to the listener that might sound like it's choose which one there would be chaos under, but it's actually they were rated individually. I think this is the problem. To your point earlier, Cameron, that the Conservatives have is that when compared to say 2015, and I know that there are some debates about how much that actually made a difference, the Alex Salmond thing anyway, but fundamentally we've had 2 of the last 4 Conservative governments have been hung parliaments, one with a formal coalition, one with a conference and supply agreement. And, I'll leave it to others to talk about whether there's been chaos or not in the last year. Certainly felt that way with the different prime ministers the Conservatives have had. Granted, that's not really to do with hung parliaments or not or anything because they've got a majority, but that sense of instability and turbulence, it feels like it's very much associated with the Conservatives at the moment rather than Labour. So I just wonder whether this is something that you can get away with as an argument after 4 or 5 years of relatively stable coalition government, but when you're sort of 14 years or so that it will be in next year and all that's gone on from Brexit onwards, essentially, to project chaos on the alternative feels like a challenge. I mean, I can certainly understand why you'd want to do it, but I feel like it's actually going to be more in policy and delivery, and also trying to play on any doubts the public have about Labour, I suspect, rather than chaos narratives around chaos.
Yeah, you can imagine a TV debate, can't you, where if Rishi Sunak was to level that at Keir Starmer, he would just start laughing almost.
But you get these moments in these debates. I remember very distinctly, and this isn't me sort of saying this is right or wrong, but just like observing what the public responds to these different things, how the public respond. When Ed Miliband was in a debate with David Cameron, I think it was, in sort of 2015, he was asked something along the lines of, did the last Labour government spend too much money? And he said no, and there was almost like shocked, shock and anger in the audience. And again, people can debate whether that's right or wrong or whatever, but like fundamentally that's where the public's mind was at. And I suspect it just springs to mind, if you mentioned the debate there, Cameron, I can well imagine Sunak projecting chaos on the alternative, given what's happened, would get similar sort of responses. I mean, Holly, what do you make about some of these numbers?
I think as well, given what happened the last 2 times there were hung parliaments, that might stick in people's minds. I don't know if that'll just stick in our minds, because we think about these things all the time, or if it will stick with the general public. But for example, when we had the hung parliament in 2010 and the coalition agreement happened between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, that felt like it happened quite quickly and relatively straightforwardly, even though it hadn't had to happen for a long time and there wasn't particular modern precedent for that. 2017 sticks in my mind with the minority government because of the fact that Theresa May called that election thinking they were going to probably do quite well, and it beat them. Well, given the local election results they had before that, they were expecting to win a majority comfortably. For that then not to happen and them have to set up a minority government with the supply and demand agreement, as you said, Cameron, that took, I think, nearly about 3 weeks to set up. So that's 3 weeks when following an election where there's a lot of things going on in a lot of people's lives that they need sorted out. 3 weeks of uncertainty, and even once they'd sorted it out, the fact that was more of an informal arrangement and not a coalition meant that there were things that happened throughout the life of that parliament where the Conservatives struggled to get things through. The DUP were kind of holding them to ransom on some legislation to do with Brexit. There was a lot of uncertainty that happened throughout that parliament because of the fact that there was a Conservative
party, right? Like the ERG have almost become household political, not household names maybe, but like it's political circles that everyone's looking at what's the ERG going to say, and
exactly.
It's hard to imagine. Whilst, who knows, it's hard to imagine similar tensions in the Labour Party and a minority government. I mean, people would probably hotly contest that with the socialist group there. I mean, maybe they'll have their policies that they want to pursue, but they don't feel as quite fundamental to what's going on in terms of at the country as negotiating the Brexit withdrawal agreement. I may well have egg on my face in the future, but that again, it's not. This isn't about sort of backing one over the other. It's just we don't have that same huge get Brexit done withdrawal agreement aspect where there's an obvious minority within the governing party that has a particularly distinct view on it. That dynamic doesn't feel like it's there in the Labour Party. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are clearly tensions around austerity and around different nationalisation of public services and all this sort of stuff. But I don't know that it quite has the same urgency as some of that other stuff, and quite the same ability to completely destabilise a government. But we will see. I guess let's do final remarks then. Let's focus on the Conservatives. We've touched on this a bit during this podcast, but I'll come to you in turn, Cameron and then Holly. Like, what does Rishi Sunak and what do the Conservatives need to do in the next sort of year or so to give themselves a fighting chance next year?
Delivery, as you touched upon, Kieran. And I think particularly in the economy, because the cost of living, every time we ask, before the locals, we ask them what's going to determine your vote, the cost of living comes out way on top. Our issues index, which tracks the most important issue, is dominated by the economy, inflation right now. If he can make progress on that, then that gives him something in the elections. He wants to be winning on the economy. That's the Conservative brand for the past decade or so, is winning on the economy. And interestingly, our economic optimism index is ticking up on that. So it's still pretty dire, but it is the highest it's been since early January 2022, before Ukraine happened. So there is something happening there, and that's where I would be pushing to try and progress on, making a notable change for people on the cost of living if you want a fighting chance.
I'd agree with that, and I'd also throw into the mix something on public service delivery. Things like the NHS, always hotly contested issues when we come to a general election. I know Labour released a plan yesterday, so they're obviously throwing their eggs into in that direction. I think the Conservatives also need to just Rishi Sunak's brand itself, as we said, has kind of plateaued, but the Conservative government numbers cannot drop any lower in terms of public perception on whether they're doing a good
challenge
job.
Accepted, says the
they can't. The damage to the brand over the past, over the short term and the long term, is going to be a big challenge for them in terms of the attack lines that Labour are going to be able to throw at them in the run up to the next election. So if they want to deflect from that by showing some of those delivery aspects, as Cameron said, I think that's probably the best way forward, and having a kind of stable or stable-ish economy, or some sort of kind of positive economic message in the direction of travel, I think will certainly help them with the attack lines that we know that they're going to throw at the Labour Party at the next election, to do with their previous economic track record.
I agree with a lot of that, and I think one dynamic that I would add in that hasn't been discussed a lot, I don't think, is tax. I have a feeling that tax is going to be something the Conservatives seek to make a dividing line at the next election, whether that's about cutting taxes going into an election and then saying Labour will raise them. It's obviously a traditional dividing line between the parties, Labour's tax bombshell type stuff. I think it also speaks to cost of living, of course, money in people's pockets potentially, and that sort of thing. And then it also speaks to the idea of, okay, Labour might have certain policies on, I don't know, increasing spending on this, that, or the other. How are they going to pay for it? So and not least, I think 2019 Conservatives a lot of them are fed up about the levels of taxation within the Conservative government have brought forward. So I fully expect that to be a dividing line. It comes with that major challenges, though, doesn't it? Not least as we've had a Conservative government under Liz, short-lived, with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, that did try to cut taxes substantially and blew up the economy in doing so. And so it gives Labour a bit of a pushback on some of these arguments, particularly if the Conservatives go into the next election promising additional tax cuts that haven't happened yet. If you're Labour, you can well imagine trying to say, well, you tried that before and look what happened. And also, I think there is a sense of how much will people believe Rishi Sunak, given he's been the Chancellor that's proceeded over a lot of these tax rises. But nevertheless, I find it hard to believe the Conservatives would go into the next election not either having just recently done some tax cuts or promising them. But it's something to watch out for, particularly considering that we know the public want extra money for public services, but at the same time, the cost of living is a real challenge for people. So where does that balance fall, and where do further tax rises, if they are to come from, etc., etc. So I'd keep an eye on that one personally. That's all we've got time for this week's podcast. If you like what you hear, please do like and subscribe. Share us on social media or wherever you get your podcasts. Always grateful to be joined by Cameron, Garrett and Holly.day for their expert insight. Thank you guys for joining us. And on the next episode, we'll be trying to take some listener questions as we look ahead to the next general election. So if you do have any questions for the team on the podcast, please do reply underneath this podcast or tweet me at keiran.pedley. Or Cameron and Holly, and we'll be sure to try and add you to the list. It's something we want to try. Hopefully, keep them clean, keep them on topic, and respectful. But yes, that's something we want to try. But what could go wrong in the run up to the next election? Because we know that obviously the polls only get more and more attention. But for now, that was the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. Thanks for listening.